I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine the year is 1169. The Irish Sea is restless. A thick mist rolls in over the coast of Wexford, and out of that fog, sails begin to appear. Tall, triangular sails that catch the wind and move with a purpose. These sails are not from Viking longships. They're broader, sturdier, built to carry both men and horses. And on board are warriors unlike anything Ireland has ever seen before. They wear chainmail that glints beneath the grey skies. Their shields are painted, their helmets conical, their swords sharp and heavy. These are the Normans, men who, only a century earlier, had swept into England and carved out a kingdom for themselves. Men who now look westward, to Ireland. But they didn't come here by chance. They were invited. Dermot MacMurrough, the ousted King of Leinster, had been driven from his lands by rivals. Now desperate, humiliated, and with nowhere else to turn, he crossed the sea to England and sought help from King Henry II. And Henry, ever the strategist, gave him permission to recruit Norman knights. Knights who, hungry for land and power, leapt at the chance to carve their own dominions out of Irish soil. And so, in 1169, the first ships landed on the coast of Bannow Bay, near County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. A small force at first, but behind them would come more. Richard de Clare, known to history as Strongbow, battle-hardened knights from Wales, men who brought with them not only swords and shields, but castles, laws, and a new way of life. Ireland was about to change forever. This is the story of the Norman Conquest of Ireland, a tale of ambition, betrayal, cultural collusion, and the beginning of 800 years of entanglement between Ireland and England.
And realism impelled me to admit that we still have a long, long way to go. But I think the important thing is that we are making progress.
También hay que esclarecer que no solamente en
It's been a long
relaciones
journey. I hope you also agree that it has been so far a
all
good
steps
one.
for man.
Người đồng bào cả nước,
I am pleased to make
tất cả mọi người đều sinh ra có quyền bình đẳng.
Seven, six, five, four, three, two, one.
So before we jump straight into the Normans landing at Bannow Bay, we need to talk about what Ireland actually looked like in the mid-12th century, because the Ireland they encountered was very different from the centralised kingdoms of England or France. Ireland was basically a patchwork. It was a mosaic of dozens of smaller kingdoms, also known as Tuatha, each ruled by their own king or chieftain. And above these smaller kings were the provincial kings, and they ruled the likes of Munster, Leinster, Connacht, Ulster, and Meath. And all over them was supposed to be the High King of Ireland. Now, that was supposed to be because in reality, the idea of a High King was more symbolic than absolute. Ireland wasn't a unified nation in the way England was after the Norman Conquest of 1066. Basically, power was fluid. Alliances were made and broken constantly. One day you were allied to your neighbour, the next day you were burning his crops. Kings gained prestige not by ruling peacefully, but basically by raiding, by extracting tribute, by forcing others to acknowledge their authority. It was really, I suppose, a very warrior based society. Now, another important part of this landscape was the legacy of the Vikings. The Vikings basically had first raided Ireland in the late 8th century. And by the 9th and 10th centuries, they'd established long forts, fortified settlements, all along the coast. cities like Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all began basically as Viking bases. And by the 12th century, the descendants of these Norse settlers, of the Vikings, had become fully integrated into Irish society. They more or less became Irish. They were Christian at this stage. They spoke both Old Norse and Irish, and they were basically fantastic traders. Dublin, in particular, was actually one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan towns in the Irish Sea region. So you had this mix, this very unique mix. It was rural Gaelic kingdoms based on kinship and also cattle wealth. So these urban coastal towns with strong trade connections to Britain and the continents, mainland Europe. Now, here's the thing, while the system had worked for centuries, it also made Ireland really vulnerable. Because there was no central authority strong enough to unite the island against an outside invasion, there was no, say, Irish army, for example, the rivalries between Irish kings often opened the door to outsiders. It was fractured, it wasn't united, it wasn't strong. And that's exactly what happened with Dermot MacMurrough, who was King of Leinster. Dermot was an ambitious, ruthless, and he was a deeply unpopular king. In 1166, he was driven out by a coalition led by Rory O'Connor, who was the High King of Connacht, and Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni, whose wife Dermot had abducted years earlier. That's a long story. We'll come back to that one in a while. The point is, Dermot was out, and instead of accepting his fate, he did something unprecedented. He went to England and then on to Aquitaine in modern day France, seeking help. And it was that decision, Dermot's exile and appeal to the Normans, is what sets this entire story in motion. All right, so we've set out the scene. Ireland in the mid 12th century, fragmented and politically unstable. And now let's zoom in on one man who we just mentioned, Dermot MacMurrough, the King of Leinster. Dermot is basically one of those characters in history who was both pivotal and controversial, depending on basically how you look at him. He's either a desperate ruler doing whatever it takes to regain his throne, or he's a trader who opened Ireland up to centuries of foreign domination. Most Irish chroniclers do lean toward the latter view. So, what happened? In 1166, Dermot was forced into exile. A coalition of Irish kings, led by Rory O'Connor, the High King, and Tiernan O'Rourke, basically had enough of him. Now, Dermot wasn't exactly loved either. He was known for being aggressive, ambitious, and ruthless. And years earlier, he had made a huge political blunder. He abducted Dervorgilla, the wife of Tiernan O'Rourke. This wasn't just some romantic scandal. It was a direct insult to a powerful Irish lord. Now, even though Dervorgilla may have gone willingly, there's debate open to that, O'Rourke never forgot. It was an insult, and I think when you looked at it from her perspective, whether Dermot kidnapped her and whether she went willingly or unwillingly, it was still would have been a huge insult to O'Rourke, and I think Dermot would have known that, and that grudge played a role in Dermot's downfall. So Dermot fled, and instead of trying to rally support within Ireland, he took a very unusual step. He sailed across the Irish Sea and went to England. He sought out King Henry II, who was ruling not only England, but also huge swaths of France. Now, Henry II was in France when Dermot MacMurrough met with him. Specifically, MacMurrough travelled to Aquitaine, where Henry was conducting military campaigns at the time to seek his permission to recruit Norman knights to help reclaim his kingdom of Leinster to be specific. Now, Henry II was cautious about this. He wasn't about to commit himself directly to an Irish war, at least not yet. But he did give Dermot something valuable, and that was permission. He allowed Dermot to recruit Norman lords and knights from his realm to help him reclaim Leinster, and that was all Dermot needed. So Dermot went to Wales, and this is where he found some very, very eager allies. The Norman lords in Wales were a tough bunch. They were second and third generation conquerors, descended from those who had taken England in 1066, and they were always looking for new opportunities to expand their fortunes. Ireland, to them, sounded like a land of opportunity, fertile, wealthy, and probably the most important, politically divided. One man in particular caught Dermot's attention: Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke. He's better known as Strongbow. Now, Strongbow's nickname comes from his skill allegedly with the longbow, but it also suggests strength of character. And at this point, though he wasn't in the best position, Strongbow had lost favour with Henry II. His estates were under pressure and he needed a chance to rebuild his fortune and his reputation. So Dermot offered him a deal that was almost too good to refuse. If Strongbow helped him retake Leinster, he could marry Dermot's daughter, Aoife, and would inherit Leinster after Dermot's death. Now that's huge. That's a lot of land we're talking about. We're talking about offering up an entire kingdom as a reward. It just goes to show how ambitious Dermot was. He really, really wanted to get this back. I don't think it was necessarily just for the land, but I think it was basically to get back at Tyrone and O'Rourke as well. So Strongbow didn't jump immediately, but the seeds were planted. Meanwhile, Dermot also secured the support of other Norman lords in Wales: Robert Fitzstephen, Maurice Fitzgerald, and later Raymond le Gros. These men agreed to come over with small forces of knights, archers, and soldiers, basically to test the waters. And in 1169, the first group arrived. Now, it wasn't massive, maybe a few hundred men. Historians estimate 500. Now, within those 500 knights, they include heavily armed knights and archers, but compared to the lightly armed Irish warriors, these Normans were a different breed altogether. They fought in close formation, they had chainmail armour, they had a powerful cavalry, and they knew how to build fortifications very, very quickly. Now, that landing at Bannow Bay marked the beginning of the Norman invasion. What started as Dermot's personal gamble would snowball into something much bigger: an invasion that would eventually draw on Strongbow himself and ultimately King Henry II. So if you kind of I want you to picture the scene in 1169. If you've ever been to Bannow Bay in Wexford in the southeast of Ireland, some of you may have, some of you may have never even been to Ireland. But it's a small beach, it's a small enclave, and it's actually a good idea if you even use Google Maps so you can see exactly where they landed. So it was basically a small fleet of ships pulled into Bannow Bay and also Bannow Island. Bannow Island is now not necessarily an island anymore because it is all silted up. But at that time, they could have pulled in behind the island, so their ships weren't visible from the sea, and the hills also sheltered them from other rivalries within the Kingdom of Leinster and Munster as well, because it's on the border. But basically, the land at Bannow Bay, the islands, they hooked up there for a few days. On board, maybe, as we said, 400 to 500 men, tiny compared to the thousands that Irish kings could call upon. But these weren't, again, ordinary warriors. This was a highly trained strike force, basically, led by Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice de Prendergast, with a handful of heavily armoured knights, Welsh archers, and professional foot soldiers. Now, you might be wondering, why Wexford? Why there? Why did they land there first? Well, it was part geography, it was a convenient port close to Leinster, but also politics. Wexford is one of those old Viking towns, and it had developed into a bustling trading hub. If Dermot could bring it under control, he could have a strong foothold to build from. Now, Dermot marched with his Norman allies straight to Wexford. When they landed in Bannow Bay, it took them about 2 days roughly to get to Wexford by the time the Normans got there, organised themselves, and marched onto the town. The town was walled and defended, and the townspeople weren't about to roll over. They did resist, but here's the key difference: the Irish way of war relied heavily on skirmishing, ambushes, and fast moving raids. Basically, what nowadays we would call guerrilla warfare. The Normans, on the other hand, specialised in siege warfare. They were patient, methodical, and disciplined. They set up camp, began blockading, and used their archers to pin down the defenders. After 2 days, the people of Wexford surrendered. Dermot was back in business. With Wexford secured, he granted lands nearby to Fitzstephen. It was very, very quick. He granted the lands to Fitzstephen as payment. Now, this is an important moment. It shows really how quickly the Normans shifted from basically hired help to landowners in Ireland. And the invasion was already starting to take on a life of its own. But Dermot wasn't satisfied. His eyes were on a bigger prize, Waterford. Now, like Wexford, Waterford was a former Viking stronghold, strategically vital because of its harbour. And if anyone has ever been to Waterford, again, a lot of listeners may not have been there before, but it's on the river shore, and that river shore leads out to sea as well. And if you continue on that river out to sea, you pass Bannow Bay and Bannow Bay Island. So again, if you can go onto Google Maps, it'll get you'll have a very more idealistic way of how to see it, why that place was so strategic. So it was by 1170, Dermot's forces were ready to make the move to Waterford. This time, actually, Strongbow himself got involved. Now, remember that promise Dermot made earlier? His daughter Aoife, with her, the inheritance of Leinster? Strongbow finally committed. He arrived in Ireland with a larger force this time, roughly around 1,200 men, including, again, 200 knights. Now, for medieval Ireland, this was a game changer. Together, Dermot and Strongbow laid siege to Waterford. The defenders put up a tough fight, but the Normans, again, were relentless. Their siege techniques, undermining walls, storming with ladders, coordinated attacks, were a level Ireland had not seen before. And when the town fell, it was brutal. Norman chroniclers admit that many of the defenders were slaughtered. This was part of their strategy. Terror was a weapon. Now, by making an example of Waterford, they sent a message to the rest of Ireland. Resistance would be costly. Now, while the Normans took control, the aftermath brought further instability. Later, during a period of rebellion, the Northmen, or Norse Irish as they were called, of Waterford prepared to massacre the Norman invaders, and they did succeed when Strongbow left the town, indicating internal conflict and suffering following the initial conquest. And then came the moment that sealed the Norman stake in Ireland. Strongbow married Aoife MacMurrough in Waterford. The marriage wasn't just personal, it was deeply political. And actually, in one ceremony, Strongbow positioned himself as Dermot's heir. And for the Normans, this was a land grab dressed up as a wedding. For the Irish, it was the start of a foreign dynasty. From here, the conquest really did gather momentum. The Normans had proven their military superiority. Their heavy cavalry could smash through Irish formations. Their archers could pick off enemies at a distance, and their discipline in siege warfare made walled towns vulnerable. But their success also drew attention and alarm. Other Irish kings, they started to realise that Dermot had unleashed a force that he might not be able to control. Rory O'Connor, the High King, immediately began to mobilise, and King Henry II, watching from across the Irish Sea, started to worry as well that Strongbow was basically becoming too big for his boots. He was becoming too powerful in his own right. And what began as Dermot's desperate bid for power was really spiralling into something much larger, a conquest that was pulling in kings, armies, and soon even the English crown itself. Okay, so let's fast forward to 1171. Now, at this point, Dermot MacMurrough's gamble has paid off, but only up to a point. He has the kingdom of Leinster back, thanks to Norman steel. Wexford is in his hands, Waterford has fallen, and Strongbow is not just an ally, but also his son-in-law. But here's the problem. Dermot's time is running out, and in 1171, he dies. Probably of natural causes, though some sources suggest illness, and with his death, a huge question is suddenly on the table. Who rules Leinster now? And just on another note, the series that I produced on YouTube about the Norman Way, you can see in those episodes when I do go to Ferns, you can see Dermot MacMurrough's grave. where he set up Fern's Castle and the cathedral as well. So he's buried in that graveyard. If you want to have a look at it, go onto the Norman West series on my YouTube channel. So Dermot had promised Strongbow the succession through his marriage to Aoife, but in Irish law, kingship didn't work that way. Ireland didn't follow a strict kind of rules or basically anything England or France had. Instead, succession was based on tanistry. And that meant a system where the kingship went to literally the best man within the royal kin group. And that often meant brothers, cousins, nephews fighting it out. The idea of an Anglo Norman lord inheriting a throne through marriage was completely alien to the Gaelic system, completely alien to the way of Irish life. But Strongbow, he literally didn't care about Irish law. He claimed Leinster outright. And with his knights and castles, he had made and had actually the muscle to back it up. In effect, Strongbow became the most powerful figure in Ireland. So naturally, this sent shockwaves through the rest of the island. Rory O'Connor, again the High King, saw what was happening and was not about to let a Norman Earl carve out a dynasty unchecked. It would have made him look weak if he didn't respond. So he rallied his forces to push back, and in 1171, Rory launched a campaign against the Normans, laying siege to Dublin. Now, Dublin was a major prize. It was Ireland's richest town, a former Viking hub with connections across the Irish Sea. And Strongbow and his men had seized it earlier in 1170 after a dramatic attack, actually scaling the walls and taking the town by storm. So Dublin gave the Normans not just wealth, but also a strategic base. Losing that would have been devastating for them. So when Rory O'Connor surrounded Dublin with what some chroniclers say an army of 30,000, this is probably exaggerated, but still massive by Irish standards, it looked like Strongbow might be finished once and for all. But again, here's where Norman discipline and tactics made that difference. Instead of waiting inside the walls, the Normans launched a sudden sortie, charging out of the city with their cavalry and catching Rory's army off guard. The Irish forces broke and scattered. It was another crushing demonstration of how a smaller, professional force could beat a larger and less organising host. So at this point, Strongbow did look unstoppable. But success created its own problems. Once again, across the water, King Henry II of England was watching closely. And he really didn't like what he saw. He was getting worried at this stage. So you have to remember Henry's mindset. He ruled an empire stretching from the Scottish borders down through England, Wales, and vast parts of France. He was always wary of his barons becoming too independent. Strongbow setting himself up as a kind of a quasi-king in Ireland wasn't exactly the kind of thing Henry feared, but it was as well. So a powerful lord going rogue, basically, potentially creating a rival power base in effect. And that's what he did. So Henry decided to act. And in October of 1171, he personally crossed the Irish Sea with a massive fleet. It was said to be over 400 ships. Now, this would have been the largest force ever to sail to Ireland up to that point that we know of. He landed at Waterford with thousands of knights and soldiers. And for the first time, an English king had set foot on Irish soil. The effect was immediate. Strongbow, knowing he could not stand against Henry, submitted to him there and then. The other Norman lords also did the same, and even many Irish kings, seeing the writing on the wall, came to Henry and offered homage. Now, they weren't necessarily conquered, they retained local control, but they did acknowledge Henry's overlordship. And it was just like that Ireland became part of the Angevin world, the empire, Henry's empire. It wasn't a full conquest yet, but Henry had established the precedent. The English crown now claimed authority in Ireland for the first time. This was the birth of centuries of entanglement, sometimes direct rule, sometimes indirect influence, but always a shadow hanging over Irish politics. And all of it traced back to Dermot MacMurrough's desperate gamble. Okay, so now we have Henry II, who is now in Ireland. October 1171. This is a big deal because it's the first time an English king actually set foot on the island. He arrives with an overwhelming force, like we said, thousands of knights, soldiers, and he also brought along with him clerks and administrators, so it wasn't just all military. But here's the interesting thing: Henry doesn't come just to fight, he comes to establish dominance, his authority. And the first thing he does is make the Norman lords like Strongbow, Fitzstephen, Fitzgerald, and the rest swear loyalty directly to him. And this is classic Henry. He doesn't want Ireland turning into some independent Norman colony like Normandy or Sicily had become for other families. He wants Ireland tied directly to the English crown. So next he turns his attention to the Irish kings. And here's where things get fascinating. Many of the Gaelic rulers, especially in the south and east, actually come to Henry voluntarily. They submit, offer tribute, and recognize him as overlord. Now you might ask why. Well, partly out of fear. Henry's army was huge, but also because some see it as politically useful. Aligning with Henry could give them leverage against their rivals. Again, remember at this stage, not all of Ireland was united with each other. This sets up a pattern that lasts for centuries. Some Irish lords resist, others collaborate, depending on what suits their local interests at that time. Now, Henry doesn't claim all of Ireland for himself. Instead, at the Council of Waterford, he divides authority carefully. Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford, three of the richest coastal towns, are taken into direct royal control. These became English crown possessions, with royal officials running them. Okay, so Strongbow is confirmed in Leinster, but Henry's vassal, that's what he's called. He is basically Henry's vassal, so he doesn't rule it directly, not as an independent ruler. Now, other lands are parcelled out to Norman lords under similar terms. Then in 1172, Henry gets something that gives his conquest international legitimacy, and that was papal approval. Okay, so Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope in history, had already issued a document years earlier called the Laudabiliter. Okay, the Laudabiliter, supposedly granting Henry authority to reform and oversee the Irish Church. So whether this bull is authentic or not, it is debated by historians, but Henry certainly used it as propaganda. Now, at the Synod of Cashel in 1172, the Irish Church formally submitted to Henry's reforms, aligning itself more closely with Rome and the wider Latin world. This gave the invasion a religious stamp of approval. It wasn't just conquest, it was framed as church reform, in the guise of church reform. So the church did basically have a lot to do with Ireland's invasion and colonial conquest. From this point on, we get something called the Lordship of Ireland. Technically, Ireland wasn't part of the Kingdom of England yet. Instead, it was a separate lordship granted to Henry by the Pope and passed down to his heirs. So that's why later English kings are called, Lord of Ireland, long before they claim the title King of Ireland. So now let's talk about the impact basically on the ground. Why and what did the Norman rule actually look like? Well, first, castles. That was the number one thing. Again, with the YouTube series I made on the Norman Way, you'll see lots of this as well. The Normans built castles everywhere they went. If you go to the southeast of Ireland, but in particular, the whole landscape is dotted with Norman castles and churches, and there's always little bits around, but particularly in the southeast of Wexford as well, South Wexford. So the Normans built castles everywhere they went. Leinster, Munster, Mott and Bailey fortresses sprang up really, really quickly. And these wooden and earth structures were quick to build, but they also gave the Normans a massive military edge. Now, from castles, they could dominate the surrounding countryside, control trade routes on the rivers and so on, and defend against Irish counterattacks. And within a generation, stone castles began replacing them. Places like Kilkenny, Trim, and Carrickfergus. These castles weren't just military bases, they were symbols of power. They showed that the Normans are here and they're not going anywhere. Second, Towns. The Normans revitalised Ireland's urban life. Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford became centres of English administration, trade, and law. Remember, Henry controlled these directly, not Strongbow. They were reorganised along English lines with new streets, markets, and guilds. Even English settlers moved in, bringing with them different languages, customs, and legal systems. And that brings us to law. The Normans introduced English common law, which operated alongside Irish Brehon law. This created a kind of, I suppose, legal patchwork. And in areas under Norman control, disputes were settled in English courts. But in Gaelic areas, Brehon law still ruled. And over time, this dual system caused countless and endless friction. Finally, we have land holding. The Normans introduced the feudal system. Land was granted in fiefs, so basically to Normans, lords, who then held it from the king. This was, I suppose, very different from the Irish system, where land was controlled collectively by kin groups. It meant dispossession for many Gaelic families and a fundamental reshaping of the land ownership. But here's the key thing to remember: Henry's intervention didn't conquer all of Ireland. His control was strongest in the east and the south, so Leinster, parts of Munster, and the towns. The west and north, Connacht, Ulster, remained largely under Gaelic control. And for the next century, Ireland would be divided between Norman controlled regions and Gaelic territories. So sometimes they fought, sometimes they cooperated, and sometimes the lines between them just blurred completely. And one last important detail: the Normans didn't just bring soldiers and castles, they also brought a hunger for, wealth and culture. And this is where the story takes a bit of a darker twist, because they dug into Ireland. They weren't just seizing land, they were also exporting, I suppose you could say, treasures back to Europe, just as later European powers looted from, Greece, Egypt, Palestine, the Levant, anywhere and beyond. Many Irish manuscripts, reliquaries, and treasures began to vanish into Norman and later English hands. It's a very common thing through, I suppose, the term we use, colonial terms nowadays. They did it right up until, I suppose, a lot of places that were held under empires, even up until World War One and just after World War One and Two. So some of that material ended up in England, France, even further afield, and Ireland's cultural wealth became part of Europe's heritage, though often without Ireland's consent. So by the early 1170s, Ireland was greatly transformed, not fully conquered, but no longer independent either. A foothold had been established, and one that would never really be given up. So, by the early 1170s, Ireland was no longer what it had been just a few years earlier. The Norman arrival had changed the landscape, literally and politically. Castles rose where there had only been ring forts. Norman towns and markets were growing in places where Irish kings had ruled for centuries. And an English king was now, basically now claimed overlordship of the island. But here's the thing: the conquest wasn't complete. Again, it was far from it. The Normans held the east, parts of the south, and major towns. But the Gaelic Irish still controlled huge swaths of land, like we already mentioned: Connacht, much of Ulster, large parts of Munster. Rory O'Connor remained High King, at least in name, and Gaelic power was far from broken. Over the next century, there would be constant push and pull from both sides. Sometimes the Normans pushed west, building new castles, claiming new lands, and sometimes the Irish pushed back, reclaiming lost ground. This tension shaped Ireland for the next few hundred years, more or less 200 years. The Normans never fully conquered the island, but they never left either. You go to a lot of the north, northwest, the western part of the country, you won't really find as many castles or remnants of the Norman past there compared to particularly Wexford, Waterford, Kilkenny, and so on. But that leads us kind of, I suppose, to we look at it as a cultural blending thing. Now, what's a fascinating thing is how quickly the Normans began to adapt to Ireland as well. They didn't remain a separate ruling class forever. Initially, they did, of course. And within, I suppose, a few generations, many of them were speaking Irish, marrying into Gaelic families, and even following Brehon law. Chroniclers complained that the Normans were becoming even more Irish than themselves, a term that was used also for the Vikings. And this cultural blending created something unique. It was a hybrid, it was the Anglo Irish identity. Now, this, of course, worried the English crown. Kings in London didn't want the Norman barons in Ireland turning into Irish lords. So in 1366, nearly 2 centuries later, we see the Statutes of Kilkenny. This Statutes of Kilkenny was basically a set of laws trying to stop English settlers from adopting Irish customs, basically marrying into Irish families or even speaking Irish. The very need for those laws shows just how deep the cultural exchange had become. Now, when we talk about castles and power, the Norman castles weren't just military sites. Again, they became centres of new towns and economic life. Around Trim Castle, Kilkenny Castle, and others, markets grew, guilds were formed, and trade expanded. These castles still actually stand today as some of the most iconic landmarks of medieval Ireland. I don't have these particular castles in the Norman West series on YouTube, but I do have a lot of them in Wexford. A lot of them I didn't film. In that series, they actually deserve, I think, episodes of their own right. Now, when it comes to resistance and survival, the Gaelic Irish, though, were again never fully subdued. That's an important thing to remember. They did adapt as well. They learned Norman tactics, they hired mercenaries, and built alliances with them. And over time, Irish lords would regain large areas, especially during moments when English power weakened, like during the Barons' War in England or the Scottish Wars of Independence. Another important point to remember is even though Ireland was entangled with England from this point on, it was never assimilated. Irish culture, language, law remained resilient, surviving basically side by side with Norman and later English structures. Now, when we look back again on what we just talked about, treasures taken and so on, I want to pause here for a second and address something often left out of the mainstream story. Alongside land and power, there was also a lot of looting, just like we've seen again across whether it's Greece, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Palestine in general. The Norman and later English presence in Ireland meant that manuscripts, the cultural treasures, were all taken abroad. So many priceless Irish works ended up in private collections in England, France, and further afield. You go to some of these museums in England, the British Museum, that have a lot of stuff there from Ireland and from every other country as well. So some survive today in museums, libraries out of Ireland. And it's a reminder that conquest isn't just about territory either, it's about a cultural loss. So when we look at the big picture here, the Norman Conquest of Ireland wasn't just a short episode. It was the opening chapter in a story of domination, resistance, and entanglement that lasted for centuries. Now think about it. Dermot MacMurrough's decision in the mid 12th century to invite Norman help created a chain reaction. It brought Strongbow, it drew in Henry II, it led to the Lordship of Ireland, and from the moment on, Ireland was tied to the English crown. Again, sometimes tightly, sometimes loosely, but always tied. And I suppose the echoes of that decision carried forward. The struggles of later centuries, the Tudor reconquest, the plantations, Cromwell's campaigns, even the conflicts of the 20th century, all have their roots in some way or another in those first Norman landings at Bannow Bay. So if we step back, what do we see? A divided Ireland, vulnerable to outside intervention, a desperate king willing to gamble everything for power, a band of ambitious Norman knights eager for land and glory, and an English king seizing the chance to expand his empire. And I think from these ingredients alone come one of the most significant turning points in Irish history. And that's why the Norman conquest of Ireland still matters, because it wasn't just a medieval story, it was the start of a relationship, fraught, violent, complex, that has shaped Ireland and its place in the world ever since.